At the time of this video's publication, it will have been 6 years since I released the card battles video on the GeForce FX 5800 Ultra versus the Radeon 9700 Pro. To this day, that's probably my favorite card battles video I've ever done, but the truth is, it left the story unfinished. When ATI launched the Radeon 9700 Pro, they poked the bear, and NVIDIA wasn't about to take that humiliation lying down. While the 5800 Ultra was a card marred with design issues, NVIDIA was quick to scramble together a follow-up that fixed most of the shortcomings and presented a proper challenge to ATI's revolutionary new GPU. Of course, ATI wasn't sitting still either, and so the battle for early DirectX 9 dominance quickly started to heat up. Today on this episode of Card Battles, we're going to cover the final stage of it, the two fastest graphics cards of 2003, the Radeon 9800XT versus the GeForce FX 5950 Ultra. This is PixelPipes. To say 2003 was a tumultuous year in the world of GPUs would be an understatement. Sure, the Radeon 9700 Pro launched in late 2002, but it went unopposed until early 2003, and even then only barely, with an NVIDIA card that almost didn't exist, and which lived mostly in infamy. The GeForce FX 5800 Ultra arrived late to the party, and while it competed decently enough in games of the time that didn't make use of the new DirectX 9 standard, it did so with completely unacceptable noise levels. Of course, it didn't matter if you couldn't buy the thing, and it quickly became clear that NVIDIA was mostly trying to recoup some of their costs with a small number of shipped units while they cooked up a real response that would be easier to produce and better positioned in every way against the competition. The real response I'm talking about is the GeForce FX 5900 Ultra, a card built on the new NV35 GPU that was released in May of 2003. This card addressed some of the bigger problems of its predecessor, first and foremost by ditching the FlowFX Dustbuster cooler, but also by greatly increasing the memory bandwidth and vertex performance. Memory bandwidth was improved by doubling the memory interface from 128 bits to 256, something that had been a glaring deficit next to ATI's architecture. In exchange, they ditched the power-hungry GDDR2 type memory in favor of tried-and-true DDR, which lowered the clocks from 1000 megatransfers per second to 850. But even still, the bandwidth increased from 16 gigabytes per second to 27.2, a massive improvement of 70%. Vertex processing was improved by going from 2 to 3 vertex shaders, which again came at the exchange of a lower core clock, in this case from the record-smashing 500 MHz of the 5800 Ultra to a much more reasonable 450 MHz. Nonetheless, the number of vertices it could process increased from 250 million per second to 337.5, which was a respectable improvement of 35%. Great! It still didn't match the 4 vertex shaders ATI was using though. NVIDIA also added a technology they dubbed Ultra Shadow, which accelerated Z stencil fill and calling operations relevant to the stencil shadow rendering technique that would become more relevant later on, or so they hoped. Sadly, ATI just stood there and took the punishment. No, wait, I'm full of shit. They actually released a faster card months earlier in March, the Radeon 9800 Pro, which succeeded the 9700 Pro. Not that they really needed it. This was built on the R350 GPU and boasted improved clocks from 325 MHz to 380 MHz on the core and 680 megatransfers per second on the memory, and improved efficiency when using anti-aliasing and anisotropic filtering. Other than that, there really wasn't much they needed to do to it, and with those minor tweaks, they created a card that only made the job of competing against them all the more difficult. NVIDIA certainly retained the clock speed advantage. At a core speed of 450 MHz, the 5900 Ultra was still 70 MHz or over 18% faster than the 9800 Pro, just in terms of frequency. The memory as well, at 850 megatransfers per second, was 25% faster than ATI. But while this meant considerably more memory bandwidth on the revised 256-bit bus, the core clock didn't do much against the monster fill rate ATI had. That's because just like the 5800 Ultra, the 5900 Ultra retained the same 4 pipeline architecture with dual texture units in each pipe. ATI's 8-pipe architecture could boast a much higher pixel fill rate, even at a lower clock, and while both architectures technically had 8 texture units, limitations in NVIDIA's architecture meant that doing any texturing would half the pixel shader performance, which was already half of ATI's R300 architecture to begin with. At the time, NVIDIA claimed the NV35 improved floating point pixel shading performance by double, though I'm not sure what they're basing that on. Their shading engine still wasn't good, and there isn't much point repeating myself on that, so if you're interested in learning more nerdy, nitty-gritty detail about it, check out my previous video going over the GeForce FX series. So yes, while the 5900 Ultra was a whole lot less noisy, and potentially a lot faster in some scenarios, it clearly didn't fix every flaw. The FX, or Rankin architecture, would be doomed to pass on its genes, fundamental weaknesses that just couldn't be fixed within a generation. And that was a situation NVIDIA simply had no choice but to make the best of. For ATI's part, while the Radeon 9800 Pro was perfectly adequate to withstand the new 5900 Ultra revision, it did have half the VRAM. NVIDIA opted to double the VRAM over the 5800 Ultra to 256 MB, admittedly an unnecessary extravagance, and perhaps done to predicate on people's naivety on the importance of VRAM size at the time. But ATI was happy to play that game, and sometime near the launch of the 5900 Ultra, a 256 MB version of the 9800 Pro released, utilizing GDDR2 memory. Ironically, the same memory technology that NVIDIA abandoned after they unceremoniously dumped the 5800 Ultra. To cool the power-hungry memory, you can see they put individual silver heatsinks on each memory chip, matching the silver of the main GPU heatsink. And honestly, I think this is one of the best-looking graphics cards of the era, maybe even ever, and it's a real highlight of the collection. There were, of course, numerous other iterations of the 9800 Pro, but we won't go into all those. But if we're talking about looks, this Lead Tech 5900 Ultra with its full coverage aluminum fan shroud is a close runner-up. This card, with its two shiny fan grills, one an intake, the other an outtake, evokes a sort of diesel punk aesthetic, reminiscent of films like Sky Captain and The World of Tomorrow. They also made one just like it prior to this for the 5800 Ultra, and if ever there were a card I'd give my left bodily organs for, that would be it. That one's a pipe dream, though. A pixel pipe dream. Clearly, this was an era where if one company sneezed, the other achewed. But the final salvo of this artillery exchange would come in the fall of 2003. ATI would launch their final word on the Radeon 9000 series, the 9800XT, in October that year, while NVIDIA would release their response later the same month, the GeForce FX 5950 Ultra. Both cards would push their respective architectures to the limit, and it was a no-holds-barred face-off for who had the last say in this early generation of DirectX 9 GPUs. Once again, the Radeon 9800XT brought further increases in clock speeds. Based on the R360 GPU, its 412 MHz clock was a modest increase of 32 MHz, or about 8% over the 9800 Pro. The memory increased its throughput from 680 megatransfers per second to 730, a jump of only about 7%. The core clock was somewhat variable though if you enabled ATI's new overdrive feature, which, thanks to the addition of a new embedded temperature probe, would allow the GPU to overclock itself if thermal conditions allowed, albeit only about 5% at most. NVIDIA's 5950 Ultra, based on NV38, would boost the core clock from 450 to 475 MHz, an increase of only a little over 5%. The memory clock would increase more substantially, from 850 megatransfers to 950, a jump of almost 12%, nearly matching the memory speed of the 5800 Ultra, though this time with a 256-bit bus, carried over from the 5900 Ultra. The cooler would get an interesting new redesign, returning to the dual-slot blower-style look, except it wasn't a blower. The fan actually pulled air in from the outside in an effort to benefit from the cooler ambient temperature outside the computer case. So it was a sucker cooler then. Of course, this necessitated optimizing your case's airflow in somewhat the opposite way you normally would. For example, in my test system here with an NZXT Tempest, I'd probably want the side panel fan switched around to be an exhaust. It's not going to hurt it if I leave it as an intake, but it really wouldn't be ideal for the 5950's unique cooler if it were a permanent resident. And so, with the introduction of these products, the stage was set for a contentious battle between the two fastest cards of the generation. And being that there isn't much difference between them and the middle child products that preceded them, these are the ones I decided to focus on for this card battles episode. The mammoth-sized GeForce FX 5950 Ultra will go up against the much slimmer Radeon 9800XT in 14 contemporary tests, and I have a couple people to shout out for making this video possible. This reference 5950 Ultra I have is courtesy of a generous donation several years ago by Martin, so thank you very much if you're watching. The 9800XT was one I purchased, but I might have accidentally dropped it on the tile floor and killed it a couple years ago. But it's alive again thanks to the help of Pancake Puppy, who has aided this channel many times in the past, so thank you once again. Anyway, with all that out of the way, I think that's enough yapping. It's time to move on to the benchmarks. As always, we'll be using an overpowered CPU and newer, but not necessarily the newest available drivers that I've found perform the best with the best image quality. Longtime viewers might remember image quality being a particular issue in this era where NVIDIA liked to cheat with their rendering quality, so we have to even the playing field as much as possible. Overdrive was not enabled on the 9800XT. Please check the description below for all the test system details. Let's begin. Starting of course with 3D Mark 2001, we aren't seeing a big difference between the two in this DirectX 7 and 8 test, which doesn't come as a surprise. The FX architecture has always been well suited to legacy workloads, and while the 9800XT pulls ahead just slightly, they appear fairly evenly matched here. 3D Mark 03 grows the distance slightly between them, but again, not a night and day difference I would say. This benchmark only has one DirectX 9 test at the end, making most of the score heavily weighted towards legacy tests. That being said, the 9800XT got 52.1 FPS in that last test, Mother Nature, while the 5950 Ultra only got 39.6, so a pretty clear indication of things to come for DirectX 9 stuff. And 3D Mark 05 is where the DirectX 9 stuff gets ugly. It's a tough test even for the 9800XT, but outright torture for the 5950 Ultra. Like, I kid you not, there were mid-range cards in 2003 from ATI that were scoring much higher than this. In fact, the lowest budget cards in NVIDIA's next generation GeForce 6 line would match or exceed this score. Have I got the point across yet? It's bad. Alright, but Aqua Mark III gives a bit of a respite for the FX card, even while boasting some DirectX 9 features, although it's certainly not a very intensive test for the API. There's almost 1,000 points between them, but actual frame rates showed only about 7 frames difference, with the 9800XT getting 55.9 FPS. Now, Unreal Tournament 2004 is an interesting one. Using the Ice Tomb map, which is one of the most graphically intense maps in the game, shows the 9800XT beating the 5950 Ultra by a decent margin when not using AA and AF. That dynamic flips though when AA and AF are switched on, showing a decent lead for the FX card, and one of the rare examples where the 30% higher memory bandwidth seems to give an advantage. Then we have Halo, which is an early DirectX 9 test that I love to use because it gives a largely CPU-independent look at raw pixel shading performance. The gap between the averages here is about 34%, which is very significant and would have made more intensive multiplayer maps like Damnation a real struggle to run on the 5950 Ultra, whereas the 9800XT has just enough horsepower to get the job done. Now let's turn things up a bit with Painkiller, which has been upgraded to the 1.6 patch, offering visual enhancements that make better use of DirectX 9 features. And here we see the 9800XT curb stomp the 5950 Ultra once again, with nearly double the average frame rate and close to 3 times the 1% lows. And this time demo doesn't even show the whole story, because in actual gameplay, the 5950 really trips up when lots of enemies are on screen, which is a very typical scenario in this game. And now we get to Half-Life 2, a rather infamous game for GeForce FX owners back in the day. As one of the hottest anticipated games of 2004, you were probably pretty excited to play this one, but if you were a die-hard NVIDIA fan that wasn't paying much attention to reviews, you might have had a nasty surprise when Half-Life 2 refused to work in DirectX 9 mode on your hard-earned hardware. The frame rates in DirectX 8.1 mode are pretty respectable, with the margins tightening up with AA and AF enabled, but you aren't going to get the quality of effects that DirectX 9 would offer, and somehow the 9800XT still beats it anyway. Half-Life 2 Lost Coast was a playable tech demo of sorts from Valve to showcase their Source Engine upgrades, namely Bloom and a hybrid form of HDR. It'll still work in DirectX 8.1 mode on the FX 5950 Ultra, but the image quality is a drastic step down, and even the textures are noticeably less sharp. And even still, the 9800XT wins anyway. Far Cry turns up the heat once again, and this time both are playing in the same DirectX 9 arena, so no shortcuts for Team Green. As such, it doesn't look too rosy for them, as the 9800XT more than doubles the frame rates for both the averages and 1% lows. Then we get to good old Doom 3, NVIDIA's friend and ally in these trying times. Or so they'd like to think, as over time with driver refinements, ATI ate away at NVIDIA's prideful advantage in this game, despite their Ultra Shadow technology accelerating the stencil shadow technique used in its engine. Ultra Shadow made their 4-pipe architecture behave somewhat like an 8-pipe architecture when doing Z-depth and stencil operations, making it at least more competitive here against the Radeon. More competitive, but not a winner, sadly. You almost feel sorry for them at this point. The last two are going to be especially painful as we're getting into games from 2005, 2 years after these cards launched. But, I mean, chances are if you paid good money for a flagship in 2003, you'd still want to use it in 2005. And even with the fastest available GeForce FX card, that simply wasn't possible without drastically reducing the settings. The 9800XT can still max out Serious Sam 2, while its friend here can not. Our final game is Fear, and I've replicated the settings used in the 5800 Ultra versus 9700 Pro video, which I tuned to be playable on the 9700 Pro just to illustrate how far behind NVIDIA's architecture was. And now with the fastest cards of this generation, that obviously doesn't change, as the FX card is getting a fraction of the frames the Radeon card is, showing that the deficit only grew as games advanced. And now averaging out the 11 games tested, including results with AA and AF, the 9800XT gets 80.1 FPS, or about 49% more than the 5950 Ultra's 53.7 FPS. 1% lows show an even bigger 52.5% advantage for ATI. And had my test suite focused solely on DirectX 9 tests, an API these cards were heavily marketed on, it would have just been a bloodbath for NVIDIA. So yes, perhaps unsurprisingly, NVIDIA's fixes for the original NV30 GPU did not change the overall narrative. While doubling the memory interface helped some with anti-aliasing and other edge cases where memory bandwidth mattered most, they couldn't fix their shader engine without a total architectural overhaul. Even the improved vertex performance and Ultra Shadow technology couldn't even the score. But hey, at least it was quiet. Let me illustrate just how bad this really was, though, in a way that bar graphs can't quite convey. Let's use Need for Speed Most Wanted here as an example, the 2005 version, of course. Again, this is a game that the Radeon 9800XT can max out at 1024x768, and that's getting between 30 and 40 frames per second. Whereas the same settings on an FX 5950 Ultra gets you a total slideshow. I mean, nah, this is fine. Dang it. You basically have to turn off post-processing effects and all shadows entirely to get a comparable frame rate. In 2005, the 9800XT was still a competitive mid-range level card, while the 5950 Ultra was barely even budget tier. I can't imagine its owners felt very good about that. I mentioned earlier that I was using drivers that put the cards on a more even playing field in terms of image quality. For the FX card, that's Forceware 71.89, a 2005 era driver that still has very good support for the FX series. But just for giggles, I went back to a cheater era driver, Forceware 56.56, just to see if this gave NVIDIA a big boost. This was a driver released at a time when NVIDIA was getting a lot of flack from users in the press for taking big rendering shortcuts to boost performance. And you can see what I mean here in Far Cry, where the floor shading is clearly being done in lower precision. It almost looks like it could even be integer math. In Need for Speed Most Wanted, this driver actually breaks the shading on cars with shadows enabled, but while that meant a 9% gain in Far Cry, performance was otherwise slightly lower across the board, showing that 71.89 improves performance as well as image quality, and neither make any dramatic shifts to the FX series' competitive standing. NVIDIA couldn't match ATI on features either. For instance, the FX series actually maxes out at 8x anisotropic filtering, while the Radeon has the option to go to 16x, which doesn't give you a massive image quality boost, but does sharpen up that last little bit of textures in the far distance. Radeon 9000 cards would also later receive adaptive AA, which addressed aliasing inside of alpha textures, something NVIDIA would lock away to GeForce 7 and later GeForce 6 cards, but never the FX series. But did the 5950 Ultra at least improve the performance of the 5800 Ultra? Kinda? If we take a look at Fear, for example, the difference is less than a frame, although the 1% low improved by 2 frames. The 9800XT didn't grow by much either over the 9700 Pro, but it's still more, getting about 7 additional frames or 13% higher performance. How about Doom 3? Here, the 5950 Ultra, with the addition of its Ultra Shadow technology, got a few extra frames over the higher clocked but less efficient 5800 Ultra. The 9800XT gained a lot more over the 9700 Pro, getting 10 frames or about 23% more performance on average. Oh heck, one more. Let's look at Halo. And hey, this looks a lot better. The 5950 Ultra gets almost 17 more frames, or 35% higher performance than the 5800 Ultra on average, and a big increase of about 72% on the 1% lows. Now that's impressive. The 9800 XT also gets a big boost, but let's not spoil the moment for the FX card here. These two cards were the fastest of their generation, but let's also remember they were only refreshes. Back in these days, the concept of a mid-gen refresh was more common, although having 2 refreshes was less so. Nonetheless, a refresh by definition wasn't going to completely revamp the architecture within a generation. NVIDIA's refresh was obviously more drastic, doubling the width of the memory interface namely, but it wouldn't be a total rethink of the design, nor could it be. As we've seen, both cards gave mostly modest gains compared to even the first iteration of their respective lines. And that's obviously not a problem for ATI, as the Radeon 9700 Pro was already a beast of its time, and the 9800 Pro and XT only capitalized on that. But NVIDIA really needed a win after the 5800 Ultra, and that just wasn't possible. Could you game on a 5950 Ultra and be happy? Sure, in older stuff, but you wouldn't have been playing very shader-heavy games without pulling way back on the settings. And by 2005, you basically had a card that was almost devoid of value. I mean, if a sub-$100 card in 2005 could beat your 2003 flagship, what mileage did it have left? So that's the GeForce FX 5950 Ultra and Radeon 9800XT in a nutshell. Oddly, the former one, despite being exceptionally limited in usefulness, commands a higher price in the collector's market. Neither card are cheap, of course, as is usually the case with old flagships, but it's just kind of funny to me how much demand there is for, honestly, what is a failure cherry on a failure sundae. Well, I guess that's what makes it interesting to people, I suppose. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this card battles video on the final heavyweights of the DirectX 9 War of 2003. If you'd like to see more like this, then well, obviously you want to stick to this channel, because what other channel is going to put this much effort into such nonsense? Anyway, thanks for watching. I'm Nathan, and this has been PixelPipes.